Welcome to the ProfitMaxx software tutorials. This tutorial series will help you better understand the setup of your ProfitMaxx software and let your service department realize the benefits of proper technician management much quicker. Let's get started. Welcome to the tutorial for travel performance. The Travel Performance Analysis Report takes a unique look at what a few extra minutes of travel on average between service calls could be costing you. It's far more than you think. You know that some service calls are going to take longer to travel between because occasionally you're forced to dispatch a technician from one location in your service area clear across town or clear across your entire geographic area. This, however, is usually the exception. Running your techs back and forth across your territory is something you tend to do everything in your power to avoid, but sometimes it just can't be helped. You also know from your years of experience, as many of you started out in the truck, what the average travel time should be between service calls in your area. As you look at this report, you'll begin to see a pattern. The one technician that seems to always average 4 or 5 minutes longer between service calls than the rest of the team, and just how much that means to your bottom line. For this tutorial, we'll be using the Travel Performance Analysis Report. When you run this report, ProfitMaxx will show you the travel performance for each technician on your team, as well as a summary for the team as a whole. We will go through each of the values on this report so you understand exactly what the report is telling you. Each technician is identified in the upper left-hand corner of the page. In this case, we're looking at Bruce Dern's travel performance. This analysis report pulls information from other detailed reports within ProfitMaxx. Source reports are always identified at the bottom of the analysis reports. For this analysis report, information is being pulled from the Technician On Track report and from the Time Analysis report. The Technician On Track report can be found by clicking on the Forms and Reports icon on the toolbar within ProfitMaxx. Then on Service On Track, then On Track Overview, then Technician Performance, and finally the Technician On Track report. The Time Analysis report is in the same folder. If you're not already there, it can be found by clicking on the Forms and Reports icon on the toolbar, then Service On Track, then On Track Overview, then Technician Performance, and finally on the Time Analysis report. Now let's go through this report and find out exactly what it's telling us, shall we? First, the percentage of total travel hours. This is the percent of each technician's use of your team's total travel time for the period of this report. For example, within a team of 5 technicians, ideally each technician would use 20% of the team's total travel time. In this case, Bruce used 27.81% of the total travel time of your entire team. Percentage of total service calls. This is the percent of service calls that this particular technician took out of all the service calls for the entire team. Here is where you can get a quick explanation of why a tech used more travel. If their percentage of total service calls is 28%, then it would be reasonable for their percent of total travel time to also be 28%. On the other hand, if their percent of total service calls is 21%, and their percentage of total travel time is still 28%, then you've got a problem that needs to be addressed. We'll discuss that farther in just a minute. The goal is for each technician's percentage of total calls to equal their percentage of total travel hours. If a technician takes a greater percentage of service calls and uses a lower percentage of hours, then they're traveling well and profitably. Bruce took 29.27% of all service calls for the month. Percentage off benchmark. This is the difference between the percent of total travel hours and the percent of total service calls. We simply subtract the percent of total service calls from the percent of total service hours. If it's a negative number, it's expressed on the report as 0% and there's no problem. We're looking for areas of weakness amongst our team. We don't want to penalize them for meeting or exceeding our goals. If it's a positive number, the difference is shown. And it means that there is a problem because that technician is using a greater percentage of the team's total travel hours, yet not taking his or her fair share of the total service calls. Since Bruce's percentage of calls exceeded his percent of travel hours, he is exceeding our expectations and he's traveling very well. Now you may be saying, well, wait a minute, these are very small percentage differences, and what's the big deal? Well, it is a big deal. Every 1% difference in travel time is equal to 60 service calls per year. If they were a 2% difference and this tech always travels this way, using an extra 2% of travel time means that they will not be able to get to an extra 120 service calls this year alone. When you multiply that by your average service ticket for this technician, you'll see exactly what the financial impact is on your company. If the tech tries to hide their travel time in either, say, diagnostic time or service time, the balance of those numbers won't work out. You'll spot the problem very quickly on one of these analysis reports. Last, the annualized net months is where the rubber really meets the road. This shows what you're actually getting out of your technicians by showing if they had traveled up to your expectations defined in setup, how many months of actual work based on 100 service calls per month you're getting out of them. If this number is greater than 12, then fantastic. That technician is exceeding your average travel time and is doing extremely well. If this number is less than 12, well, they're missing the mark. With Bruce's efficient travel, we're getting approximately 12.8 months worth of service calls out of him. I'm liking Bruce. Now let's take a look at the travel performance section of this report. The total travel hours is the total number of hours the technician spent in travel for the period of this report. We can see that Bruce spent 44.83 hours behind the wheel during this month. The average travel hours per call is the benchmark for service calls expressed as a decimal of an hour. This is calculated by taking your two best travelers and averaging their time. This then becomes the benchmark for the whole team. Our benchmark is 0.562, or just over 30 minutes per call. The possible service calls is the total number of service calls a technician should have traveled to based on the amount of actual total travel hours divided by the average travel time that you defined in setup. For instance, if a technician uses 40 hours of travel for the month and you have an average travel time in setup of 30 minutes, the possible service calls would be 40 hours divided by half hour per call, or 80 calls. Bruce's possible service calls for the month were 79.77. The total service calls is the actual number of calls that Bruce took this month. Bruce actually took 84 calls. So in this case, he outperformed our expectation. If, on the other hand, he had only made 74 service calls, he would be underperforming. The lost calls is the number of service calls lost by underperforming in the travel category. In Bruce's case, this is 0 because he has no lost service calls. He made it to more service calls than we expected, and again, remember that we're not going to penalize the tech for meeting or exceeding our expectations. The technician who only made 74 service calls lost 6 calls by underperforming in the travel time category. Next, the average invoice is that technician's actual average invoice per billable service call. Bruce's average invoice was $185.97. So now we come to the lost revenue. The lost revenue is the number of lost service calls multiplied by this technician's actual invoice. These are real dollars left on the table. ProfitMaxx will always highlight this value in the travel performance revenue lost field. Now let's take a look at one of our other technicians. We can see in the upper left-hand corner of this report that we're looking for the travel performance for Bryant. First off, it's a percentage of total travel hours. Bryant used 24.74% of our total travel hours for our team. Bryant had 22.65% of our total service calls. So when we subtract those out, he was off the benchmark by 2.09%. Again, he actually used more travel hours, a greater percentage of travel hours than he had percentage of total service calls. When we figure his net actualized months, we actually got 10.8 months worth of work out of him. Think about that. By the end of roughly October, he was done working. We're done getting performance out of him. Under the time performance section, we can see that Brian spent a total of 39.88 hours behind the wheel. Our benchmark for average travel is 0.562. he had a total possible service calls of 70.96. That's what he should have hit. He actually only got to 65. So he had lost service calls of 5.96. When we multiply that times his average invoice of $216, we had lost revenue for Bryant of $1,287. Again, that's a fair loss. These are real dollars left on the table that Bryant should have gotten to had he traveled a little bit more efficiently. Let's take a look at our third technician, Rob Roy. We can see his name showing up in the upper left-hand corner of this report. Rob had 28.84% of our total travel hours. Rob had 27.87% of our total service calls. So he was off our benchmark by 0.97%. When we calculate his annualized net months, he was done after 11.4 months, or we got 11.4 months worth of work out of him. In the time performance section, we can see that Rob spent 46.5 hours behind the wheel. Our benchmark for average travel is 0.562. His possible service calls that he could have and should have gotten to was 82.74. He only hit 80 service calls. That means we lost 2.74 calls that we couldn't get to because Rob wasn't traveling very efficient. When we multiply that times Rob's average invoice of $219, we see that we had lost revenue of just over $600. Again, remember, these are real dollars left on the table because Rob isn't traveling efficiently. Now let's take a look at our last technician, Sean Kemp. We can see that Sean had a total of 18.61% of all travel hours, and he had 20.21% of all service calls. He actually exceeded our benchmark. He's hitting a greater percentage of calls than he is using percentage of travel. That's a good thing. We actually got 12.9 months worth of work out of Sean. Under the travel performance section, we can see that Sean spent 30 hours behind the wheel. Our benchmark for average travel is 0.562. The possible service calls that he should have gotten to is 53.38. He actually hit 58 service calls. Again, remember, he exceeded our expectations. So we didn't lose any service calls. His average invoice was $289, but again, we had no lost revenue because he exceeded our expectations. So again, Sean did fairly well. For our team summary, again, the last report of every analysis report will always show us a summary of the entire team. For our team, if you remember, Bruce had no lost revenue. Bryant had $1,287. Rob was just over $600, and Sean didn't have any lost revenue either. So our team total lost revenue is $1,887. Now remember, this is for 1 month only. This comes out to $22,655 per year in lost revenue, money left on the table that the techs should have hidden had they been traveling more efficiently. So what did we learn? Well, number one, inefficient travel can cost your company several thousands of dollars each year. It's something that you really need to pay attention to. Do your techs really know the difference that just a few extra minutes in poor travel can make? One of the things that you may want to do is tie this into their revenue goals. What would their performance numbers really have looked like had they traveled more efficiently and hit more service calls? Hey, if Bruce and Sean can do it, the rest of them can do it as well. Now, hopefully this tutorial has given you a better understanding of the travel performance analysis report. Keep in mind that you can replay this tutorial at any time to remind yourself of what the report is telling you, and also find out or refresh your memory. You can also press the F1 key on your keyboard at any time while you're looking at this report in ProfitMaxx to get detailed information. This is the end of this tutorial. Select the next tutorial you wish to view. Thank you.